Now that The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom has been out for about a month, a number of people have been starting to finish the game, and more discussion and debate is starting to ensue on the continuity of Tears of the Kingdom. Are there retcons? Are there plot holes? Are there contradictions with the story and the timeline? Well, after having played through the game myself, I think most of it can be explained away. I think most of it actually fits, and when you break it down, it arguably makes things fit overall a little bit more. But that ultimately comes down to your perspective, and that's what we're going to be talking about today.
Hey, listen!
Welcome everyone, this is Andre's Restart, and this time we are attempting to explain all the different timeline and story contradictions in The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom. But before we go further, let me point out a couple things. There will be some spoilers in this video. We are talking about timeline and story contradictions, so clearly there will be, but I'm going to be focusing on events that transpired between the beginning and towards the end of the Tears of the Dragon quest. So if you finished that already, you can experience most of the video. But towards the end of the video, I will also be talking a little bit about the end of the game as well. So you don't have to worry about endgame spoilers until the end, and I'll give you a little bit more warning once we get to that point. But with that said, I would also like to say that we are aiming to hit 50,000 subscribers by the end of the year. So if you do enjoy my content, please subscribe and hit that notification bell. With your help, we might just have a chance of hitting the goal. So what are the potential contradictions in Tears of the Kingdom? Well, again, I don't think they're necessarily contradictions, and I'll be explaining them in this video, but these are the things that some people have been arguing. The Imprisoning War. There is an Imprisoning War that takes place in the history of Zelda between the events of Ocarina of Time and A Link to the Past, but the Imprisoning War in Tears of the Kingdom takes place at the beginning of the timeline, supposedly. And that brings me to another contradiction potentially. Some people are playing through Tears of the Kingdom and saying that it is the founding of Hyrule, the Kingdom of Hyrule, with King Rauro and Queen Sonia, and they are thinking that this somehow rewrites the history of Skyward Sword. I don't agree, and we'll get to that, but that's another one of the potential contradictions. But not only do some people feel that this game isn't following the same continuity as Skyward Sword, but not even its predecessor, Breath of the Wild. And the Ganondorf that we see in this game is not the same Ganondorf we've seen in prior Zelda games, so it also seems to be rewriting the history of Ganondorf. And then there's something in the end of the game that almost feels like a bit of a plot contrivance. These are some of the big things people have been bringing up, and I think all of them can be explained in some way. Now, something that should be said about the different Zelda games is that they are all legends. They are stories being told, and these are stories that are carried out over history and time, and as more evidence presents itself, our understanding of that history may change. This is basically explained in Hyrule Historia. In fact, you know what, I'll go ahead and read what they explicitly say there. This chronicle merely collects information that is believed to be true at this time, and there are many obscured and unanswered secrets that still lie within the tale. As the stories and storytellers of Hyrule change, so too does its history. Hyrule's history is a continuously woven tapestry of events. Changes that seem inconsequential, disregarded without even a shrug, could evolve at some point to hatch new legends and perhaps change this tapestry of history itself. So basically, this came out alongside the timeline when Skyward Sword was releasing, and this was done because they didn't want to lock themselves into a corner. There will be things that will come out with the different Zelda games that may not perfectly match with what we see from prior Zelda games. It's always been the case with every single Zelda game, and it's what leads to more debate and discussion. It's the reason this video exists. I personally feel that when the different Zelda games come out and we see some potential plot hole, or maybe just an absence of information, that just opens things up for us to theorize and speculate about and have more fun with the Zelda series. I think Nintendo wants us to speculate and theorize. I think that's why they were so quiet about Tears of the Kingdom. They wanted to leave it more open for our speculation and theories because that created more conversation. we enjoyed the lead up more, and that caused a lot of people to get really excited for the game, and now Tears of the Kingdom is currently pacing to be one of the best-selling games ever, but we'll see how things shake out. And I even think Nintendo may be paying some homage or nodding to us theorists, like basically the entire Zelda fanbase, because we have the Zonai Survey Corps all throughout Tears of the Kingdom. These are people that are enamored with all the ruins in the history of Hyrule, and are doing everything they can to glean any sort of hint or clue or detail to understand more of the history. Sounds a lot like a Zelda theorist. So, in short, I think this is all in good fun, but I do think I can come up with a pretty good explanation for the potential contradictions. So first, let's talk about how some think that this doesn't even seem to follow the continuity of Skyward Sword. Skyward Sword is the first Zelda in the timeline, and Skyward Sword tells the story of the origin of the Master Sword, but it's also the beginning of this reincarnating cycle for Link, Zelda, and Ganon. At the end of Skyward Sword, when you defeat Demise, he talks about how his hatred will follow their descendants. And this is essentially the birth of the Ganon that we see throughout the generations. Now we'll get to the Ganondorf stuff a little bit later, but the events we see in Skyward Sword still happen before the events of Tears of the Kingdom, including the memories that happened thousands of years before anything else. Why? Well, in Skyward Sword, there were no Zora, there were no Rito, there were no Gerudo. But we see Rito, we see Zora, and we see Gerudo in the memories of Tears of the Kingdom, in this founding time of Hyrule. It takes place afterwards. And I think it should be noted that Hidemaru Fujibayashi is the director of Tears of the Kingdom, but was also the director for Breath of the Wild and also the director for Skyward Sword. So I think if there are any games that are to have a more solidified continuity, it would be these three Zelda games. And this is also when they came out with the timeline, and I personally think that since the creation of the timeline, they've made more of a concerted effort to have things fit slightly more neat, and I think that's why they've intentionally chosen Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom to take place at the very end of the timeline. That way it's a lot easier to fit them into everything. Simply by being so far into the future, it's easier to explain away a lot of the potential contradictions. And in Breath of the Wild, we see the goddess statues all throughout. It's clearly honoring the history of Skyward Sword, but also we hear this voice of Fi from Skyward Sword in both Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. So I don't think Tears of the Kingdom is forgetting the history of Skyward Sword. What some people may forget is that in Skyward Sword at the end, they do not establish the Kingdom of Hyrule. We simply assume that that is going to be established, and eventually it will be, but they're not a monarchy at the end of Skyward Sword. The memories we see in Tears of the Kingdom is when they are establishing that monarchy. So these memories do take place sometime after Skyward Sword, but since Demise has already been defeated and his curse has already been set with his hatred, I think the Ganondorf we see in the memories is that first iteration of that hatred. But some are even arguing that Tears of the Kingdom in some ways even disconnects from the continuity of Breath of the Wild. Why can't we see the Light Dragon in Breath of the Wild? Why can't we see the Sky Islands? Well, that's because they are high up in the clouds. In Skyward Sword, it's shown that there is a land above the clouds, and there's a sky barrier, so you can't see what's below or above. There's a separation. So in Breath of the Wild, we actually do see the divine dragons flying up into another realm beyond the clouds. We just can't see where they go. But in Tears of the Kingdom, after the upheaval, we see the islands appear, we see the Light Dragon, and these things open up, they reveal themselves. So it isn't a plot hole, it actually fits perfectly. And actually there's a side quest in Tears of the Kingdom that explains why all these islands are in the sky. After Ganondorf was sealed, because they knew Link was going to be in the future and they wanted to prepare everything for him, they made sure to raise up their Great Sky Island into the sky so he could be protected from Ganondorf when he would need to be resuscitated or brought back to after that initial attack in the prologue. And this was done by the power of the sages. So at least when it comes to the continuity of Skyward Sword, Breath of the Wild, and Tears of the Kingdom, I think it's all planned and established. But when you talk about the other Zelda games that fall into the middle, things can get messier. So let's now talk about the Imprisoning War, and by extension also Ganondorf. As I said earlier, the Imprisoning War is a historical event that took place between Ocarina of Time and A Link to the Past. It's how they deal with Ganondorf becoming the Demon King and defeating Link in Ocarina of Time. That's one of the 3 timeline splits. The other 2, he's victorious, and that leads to the events of the Wind Waker, or in the other timeline, the events of Twilight Princess. But the events that lead to Link to the Past, what they have to do is go through the Imprisoning War. They fight back against the Demon King with the power of the sages, and they seal him away. And what's interesting about that is that that's pretty much what the Imprisoning War is in the memories of Tears of the Kingdom. The Demon King is born, and the sages fight back against him to seal him away. This is exactly what happens. But there's a very key difference. The Ganondorf that becomes the Demon King, they aren't the same, and it's at a different point in the timeline. The Imprisoning War in Tears of the Kingdom happens in the era of the founding of Hyrule. The Imprisoning War that happens between Ocarina of Time and A Link to the Past is many generations into the Kingdom of Hyrule. So what gives? Is this a retcon? Well, looking at this situation now after having experienced the full context of all the story events in Tears of the Kingdom, and keeping in mind that when Zelda sees these murals that depict the Imprisoning War at the beginning, she's speaking on it from a historical perspective. She's already heard of the Imprisoning War in her studies. This is an event that isn't entirely lost to history. But, as we discussed earlier, there is a long history of Hyrule, and some events can be obscured or can be misinterpreted. So in a sense, you could argue that Nintendo has chosen this long history so they can have some retcons that still make sense, because if you go far enough down the timeline, events become legend, and it's really hard to make out what actually happened and how it happened. But we actually see the memory, so the events of the Imprisoning War and Tears of the Kingdom are clearly what they're trying to convey here. So does that mean that the Imprisoning War that happens in the middle of the timeline between the events of Ocarina of Time and A Link to the Past, is that completely out of the picture? Not necessarily. So I have this theory that I like to refer to as the eventuality theory, and it helps me to make more sense out of Breath of the Wild and how it fits into the context of the timelines, and by extension, also Tears of the Kingdom. So my eventuality theory basically just suggests that the further down history we go in the Zelda timeline, things will occur regardless. So the Kokiri will eventually become Koroks regardless of which timeline you're in. The Rito will eventually come into play regardless of which timeline you're in. Lynels will descend from the mountains regardless of which timeline you're in. And maybe eventually there will be a calamity, or even a second Imprisoning War. So with this theory, you could argue that it doesn't really matter what the timeline is anymore, because if you go far enough down history, similar events will occur. But I don't like to use this theory to just say, oh, it doesn't matter which timeline it's in. I just like to use it to help fill in some of the gaps, or help to answer some of the contradictions like we have throughout Breath of the Wild. So really what I'm getting at here is that maybe there is more than one Imprisoning War, and Imprisoning Wars are simply wars that can occur when there is a Demon King that needs to be sealed away. And we know there's been more than one Demon King now. This Ganondorf we have in Tears of the Kingdom seems to be the first incarnation of that spirit of hatred from demise. And considering that a male Gerudo is born every 100 years, and there is thousands upon thousands of years in the history of Hyrule, even after the initial beginning of the monarchy, there can be other incarnations of a Ganondorf that can take on the spirit of hatred. And there's at least 2 other incarnations of Ganondorf in the history of Legend of Zelda. There's the one we've known beforehand, the one that we saw in Ocarina of Time, that became the Demon King, and in one timeline that leads to the 2D Zelda games, the Downfall timeline. And then the other 2 leads to the adult and child timelines, and the adult, it leads to the Ganondorf we see in the Wind Waker. It's the same Ganondorf who simply lives for a very long time with his magical powers, and the same could be said for Ganondorf in the child timeline with Twilight Princess. But further down that timeline, you also have Four Swords Adventures, where there is a new incarnation, a reincarnation of Ganondorf. So this first Ganondorf does not necessarily rewrite the history of the other Ganondorfs. But what I think is kind of exciting about this concept is that this corpse of Ganondorf has been the cause of a lot of the issues of Hyrule for these thousands of years, including the repeated calamity attacks. But maybe also this Ganondorf has influenced other male Gerudos. So maybe the other male Gerudos weren't necessarily going to be evil. For example, Ganondorf, when we see him in The Wind Waker, his monologue at the end shows reasoning behind his efforts. He's more of a gray character. Maybe he was simply a male Gerudo who took on the name of Ganondorf because that may be a common name to give male Gerudos, and it was the influence of this initial Ganondorf that has a spirit of demise that eventually made this male Gerudo into the Ganondorf villain, ultimately becoming one and the same. But the Ganondorf we face in Tears of the Kingdom is the source of it all. So by looking at Tears of the Kingdom from this perspective, a lot more of it makes sense to me. Because we have this line from the first memory in Breath of the Wild, whether skyward bound, adrift in time, or steeped in the glowing embers of twilight, I have to think that the history of the prior Zelda games is still being considered. So looking at things with the eventuality theory, which helps to explain why there's different elements from different timelines in the same one, but then also taking into account how there can be reincarnations of Ganondorf, and potentially when each one of these Ganondorfs becomes the Demon King, when that happens there can still be an Imprisoning War, other things start to fit together. So for example, Calamity Ganon coming from the center part of Hyrule was always strange to me, coming from under the castle. But now that we know that there is this iteration of Ganondorf that is sealed way below the castle, and the castle was actually placed there to help keep him there, it now makes sense. Ganondorf wasn't put under the castle was put on top of Ganondorf. And it also sort of explains why Ganondorf, or at least the other incarnations of Ganondorf, have been fixated on this spot, because the very source is deep under the castle. And what I also like about the story of Tears of the Kingdom is that it now explains the origin of the sages as well. The sages are around as a failsafe for when Link fails, but also they are around to maintain this history for when the Link of Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom comes into play, he can come in and finish the source of Ganondorf under Hyrule Castle. Now what this means for where Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom are in the different timelines, that's another discussion for another day. We're just talking about the potential contradictions here. But there is still one more thing I would like to talk about, and it has to do with the end of the game. So this is your spoiler warning if you have not finished Tears of the Kingdom's main story. So Princess Zelda is saved by Link at the very end. We are led to believe that when Princess Zelda swallows a tear, she becomes a light dragon for eternity, losing herself. This is what Mineru tells us. But somehow, she comes back. And many feel that this is a plot contrivance and they just did it to have Zelda there at the end, and it takes away from the impact of her decision. I don't feel the same way about this. I actually thought it was a very touching end, and I actually also think that there are elements that supported this event occurring from early on in the game, the very beginning actually. So firstly, let me say, Zelda made that decision believing that this was the end for her. So the significance of the moment I still think is powerful. And with Link being able to heroically save her at the end, that was also significant. But there's even more of a layer here when you factor in that both Rauru and Sonia, ancestors of Zelda, sharing in the same bloodline family, essentially, play a role in bringing her back at the end. Now, how does this make sense? Well, firstly, when they bring her back, when they restore her, the event reminds me of Recall, because they cast this spell upon the Light Dragon, there's particles there, and we see a whole bunch of these gold specks. Very much like every time we use Recall, you see the gold specks. So I think this is a sign that they used a large-scale recall on Zelda, which I think is fitting because it's one of those things where Recall is used throughout the game. It's like that most important power. It's like that key thing that they bring back right at the end. Link uses it, Sony uses it, Zelda uses it, and Link even uses it as the statue and the promotional art. So it's kind of one of those things where they want it to be fully featured. And here they're using it one more time to bring her back to save the princess. But you might think that is a huge power scaling issue. How could they have this ability, just being these spirits that died a long time ago, to restore this eternal dragon that's been flying around Hyrule for thousands upon thousands of years? Well, when you break things down, I think it's actually fairly supported. So there's a memory where Rauru, Sonia, and Princess Zelda combine their powers to ward off a whole bunch of Molduga attacking the kingdom. So here they're showing that sages can combine their powers and it could lead to a compounded effect. How significant are these sage powers? Well, going back to what I talked about earlier, how there's this side quest that explains that the power of the sages, without Rauru, were able to suspend all the islands in the sky. Or at least the Great Sky Island, which that alone is an extraordinary effort. And these islands are up there for thousands upon thousands of years. So I don't really think it's a power scaling issue. And also, to first support this idea that they use recall on Princess Zelda, not only is Zelda restored, but also so is Link's hand back to the way it once was. But most importantly, when they bring her back, she's back to the way she was before she turned into the Light Dragon. Same clothing, and also the same tear. And that tear isn't just any tear. That tear is the same tear of Rauru's. It's not Sonia's tear, it's Rauru's tear. And what's interesting about this is going back to the beginning of the game, once Link and Zelda enter the room with Rauru's hand and Ganondorf, the tear falls off in the direction of Zelda. I don't think this was just a coincidence. I think this is by intention. We know that Rauru still was doing things with Link on the Great Sky Island. His influence was still there. So his influence is also still with the hand because it carried him away, and it could be responsible for the tear falling in that direction. Because Rauru was in the past and heard everything that was told by Zelda, he knew how things would transpire. So he planned accordingly. And he also knew what would happen to Zelda. And given that Rauru and Mineru could stick around with their spirit powers, it shouldn't come as that much of a shock that Sonia can as well. Not to mention that both Rauru and Sonia say they would like to meet Link in the future, and here at the very end, they make good on that. Because both the spirits of Rauru and Sonia come out, help out Link, meeting him, and combine their powers to use a massive recall, light powers from Rauru and time powers from Sonia, to restore Zelda back to the way she was before becoming the Eternal Dragon. Also explaining why she doesn't have memory of her entire interactions as the dragon, which could also be explained by her simply losing herself, but it all makes sense. So it's not a plot contrivance in my opinion. So there is my explanations for the different timeline and story contradictions we see throughout Tears of the Kingdom. In my opinion, it all makes sense, but it requires that we get a little creative and think of things and try and break it down in the way I have. And maybe there's other ways to do that. Could there be other contradictions? I'm sure. So let me know in the comments below. Maybe we'll talk about those at some point or another as well. But thank you all so much for listening and watching. This is Andres Restart, and I'll see you all really soon. Take care. Bye.